The funeral director was still shaking dirt off his hands when my sister-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said those words. Words that would haunt me for the next 15 years. Words that would drive me to do things I never thought myself capable of. Now that your wife has died, mourn, pack your things, and never come back here again. I stood there, mud from the cemetery still caked on my dress shoes, the smell of fresh earth and wilting flowers filling my nostrils, and I couldn't process what Diane had just said to me. My beloved Margaret had been in the ground for exactly 43 minutes. 43 minutes, and her own sister was already trying to erase me from existence. If you've ever had someone kick you when you were at your absolute lowest, when grief was already eating you alive from the inside out, then you know exactly what I felt in that moment. And if this story resonates with you, if you've ever been wronged by family when you needed them most, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next will show you that sometimes patience and persistence can deliver justice in ways you never imagined. The October wind whipped through the maple trees above Margaret's grave, sending red and gold leaves spiraling down onto the freshly turned soil. I watched one land directly on the bronze nameplate we'd chosen together just days before she slipped away. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved wife. That's all it said, because Diane had refused to let me add devoted daughter and sister, claiming I had no right to speak for the family's feelings. That should have been my first warning about what was coming. Diane stood there in her expensive black coat, her husband Chuck lurking behind her like a vulture in a $1,000 suit, and behind them, Margaret's elderly parents, my in-laws for 37 years, looked anywhere but at me. The betrayal in that moment was so sharp, so unexpected, that I actually laughed, not from humor, but from pure shock. "Excuse me?" I managed to say, my voice hoarse from 3 days of crying and barely speaking above a whisper at the service. Diane stepped closer, and I could smell her perfume, something floral and overwhelming that Margaret had always complained gave her headaches. "You heard me, Gary. We've been patient with this charade long enough. Margaret's gone now, and there's no reason for you to keep pretending you belong in this family." Pretending. As if 37 years of marriage was some elaborate performance I'd been putting on. "Diane, I don't understand what you're—" "The house," she cut me off, "was in Margaret's name. We checked. Her attorney confirmed it yesterday, since she never updated her will after the divorce." "What divorce?" The words came out strangled. We were never divorced. We were married for 37 years, until cancer took her from me 3 days ago. But even as I said it, something cold was spreading through my chest. Something that had nothing to do with the October chill. Chuck finally spoke up, pulling out a manila folder that looked suspiciously official. "Gary, we didn't want to have to do this here, but you're forcing our hand. Margaret filed for divorce 18 months ago, right after her diagnosis. She was worried about medical bills bankrupting both of you, so she filed to protect your assets." The world tilted sideways. Margaret and I had talked about finances during her treatment, yes. We'd talked about the mounting bills, the insurance complications, the fear of losing everything we'd worked for. But divorce? She would never have done that without telling me. She would never have— "You're lying." But my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Diane's expression didn't change. Cold. Clinical. Like she was discussing the weather. "The divorce was finalized 6 months ago, Gary, which means, legally, you have no claim to anything that belonged to Margaret, including the house you've been living in." I felt like I was drowning, like the ground beneath my feet had opened up and I was falling into Margaret's grave along with her. "That's impossible. We were living together. We were still married. She wore her ring until—" "She wore it because she felt sorry for you," Diane said, and her words landed like physical blows. "Because she knew you'd fall apart if you knew the truth. But she told us everything, Gary. How suffocated she felt. How she'd been wanting out for years but didn't know how to tell you. No, that wasn't my Margaret. That wasn't the woman who held my hand through chemo sessions, who planned our upcoming 40th anniversary celebration between treatments, who whispered, 'I love you more today than yesterday' every single night, even when the morphine made her drowsy and confused. I want to see the papers, I said. Chuck handed over the folder with what I swear was satisfaction. Everything's there. The filing, the decree, the property settlement. Margaret made sure you'd be taken care of, Gary. She didn't want to leave you with nothing. There's a small life insurance policy that names you as beneficiary. Should be enough to get you back on your feet somewhere else. My hands shook as I opened the folder. There it was, in black and white. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Margaret Louise Hartwell versus Gary Dean Hartwell. Filed 16 months ago. Granted 6 months ago. But something was wrong with the signature, Margaret's signature. I'd seen her sign thousands of things over the years. Mortgage papers, birthday cards, grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator. This looked like her handwriting, but it was too neat. Too controlled. Margaret had developed a tremor in her hands during chemotherapy. By the time this was supposedly signed, she could barely hold a pen steady. This signature is perfectly legal, Diane interrupted. Witnessed and notarized. You can contest it if you want, but I promise you'll just be wasting money you don't have on legal fees you can't afford. The funeral home staff were starting to pack up the chairs and artificial grass around the gravesite. Other mourners, Margaret's co-workers, neighbors, people I'd known for decades, were walking back toward their cars, probably assuming I was having a private family moment at the grave. If only they knew the family was trying to erase me from existence. How long do I have? I asked, and I hated how defeated I sounded. 30 days, Chuck said. That's more than generous considering you've been living there illegally for 6 months. 30 days to pack up a lifetime. 30 days to say goodbye to the garden Margaret and I had planted together, the kitchen where she taught me to make her grandmother's apple pie, the bedroom where we'd held each other through 37 years of joys and sorrows. Diane turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me one more time. Oh, and Gary? Don't even think about trying to turn Margaret's friends against us with some sob story. We've already explained the situation to everyone who matters. How Margaret was too kind to hurt you while she was sick, but how relieved she was that she'd finally found the courage to leave. They walked away then, leaving me alone with Margaret's grave and a folder full of lies that had somehow been made legal. I stayed there until the groundskeepers started giving me worried looks, until the sun was setting and the October cold was seeping through my suit jacket. I stayed until I could no longer make out the words on Margaret's headstone in the growing darkness. That night, in the house that was apparently no longer mine, I sat in Margaret's chair, the recliner where she'd spent her last weeks, wrapped in the quilt her mother made for our 5th anniversary, and I tried to make sense of what had happened. Everything Diane claimed felt wrong. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a lie, a manipulation, a cruel theft disguised as legal procedure. But the papers looked official. The signatures looked real enough to fool a notary. And I was just a 64-year-old man who'd spent the last 2 years watching his wife die by inches, who hadn't worked in 18 months because I'd been her full-time caregiver. What resources did I have to fight this? What proof could I offer beyond my own broken heart? But as I sat there in the dark, surrounded by 37 years of shared memories, something began to harden inside me. Something cold and patient and determined. If Diane thought she could rewrite history, if she thought she could steal my wife's memory along with everything else, she was wrong. I had 30 days to pack my things, but I had the rest of my life to find out the truth. And once I found it, I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of woman Diane really was. Moving out of the house I'd called home for 37 years should have been the hardest thing I'd ever done. But 3 weeks into my 30-day eviction notice, I discovered something that made packing boxes feel like a celebration. I was cleaning out Margaret's desk, the roll-top antique her grandfather had passed down to her, when I found the checkbook register she'd kept hidden in the secret compartment. Margaret was old-fashioned about record-keeping, always wrote down every transaction by hand even though we'd been doing online banking for years. Said it helped her keep track of where our money was really going. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before she died. A payment to Harold Kimmel, attorney at law, for $1,200, with a memo line that made my blood run cold. Final payment, will revision. Will revision. Not divorce proceedings. Will revision. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever had that moment where you realized everything you'd been told was a lie, make sure to comment below and share your experience. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing you're not alone. And what I discovered next proved I definitely wasn't alone in being betrayed by people who should have protected me. I sat there staring at that checkbook entry until my eyes burned. Harold Kimmel had been Margaret's attorney for years. He'd handled her father's estate, our house purchase, various legal documents over the decades. If Margaret had been secretly divorcing me, why would she be revising her will 2 weeks before she died? My hands were shaking as I dialed Kimmel's office. His secretary, a pleasant woman named Beth who'd known Margaret and me for 15 years, put me right through. "Gary?" Harold's voice was warm but cautious. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Margaret was a special woman." "Harold, I need to ask you about something. The divorce papers that Diane showed me. Did you handle Margaret's divorce?" The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Gary," Harold finally said, and I could hear him choosing his words very carefully. "I think we need to meet in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "Harold, just tell me, did you handle a divorce for Margaret?" "No, Gary. I did not handle any divorce for Margaret, and I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation about what's been going on." The next morning I sat in Harold's office while he pulled out a file thick enough to choke a horse. Margaret's file. A file that contained no divorce papers whatsoever. "Gary, Margaret came to see me 6 weeks before she died. She was concerned about something, very concerned." Harold adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "She said Diane had been pressuring her to update her will, claiming it would be better for tax purposes if certain assets were transferred to family members before Margaret's death." "What kind of assets?" "The house, primarily, and her portion of the family trust from her parents' estate. Diane convinced her there were new tax laws that would penalize you heavily if those assets passed to you as a spouse. Complete nonsense, of course, but Margaret was exhausted from treatment and worried about leaving you with financial burdens." I felt sick. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was garbage, that Diane was either grossly misinformed or deliberately lying. Margaret asked me to research it anyway, just to be sure. That's what she was paying me for in those final weeks, research into tax implications that didn't exist for a problem that wasn't real." Harold pulled out a document I recognized. Margaret's will. Her real will. "Margaret never changed her will, Gary. You inherit everything, exactly as you two planned. The house, her life insurance, her share of the family trust, it's all yours. She made sure of it." "Then how?" I couldn't finish the question. Harold's expression darkened. "The divorce papers you were shown are forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. I've been practicing law for 42 years, and I've never seen anything quite this sophisticated. Someone went to considerable trouble and expense to create those documents." The room was spinning. "So Margaret never filed for divorce. She never wanted a divorce. She loved you until her last breath, Gary, but someone wanted you to believe otherwise." I thought about Diane's coldness at the funeral, Chuck's satisfied expression when he handed me that folder, the way Margaret's parents wouldn't meet my eyes. "How far does this go, Harold?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Harold leaned back in his chair. "Gary, I've already filed a complaint with the county clerk's office about the fraudulent documents. I've also contacted the police. This isn't just civil fraud. This is criminal. What do I do in the meantime? I have 1 week left before I'm supposed to be out of the house." Harold smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "You don't go anywhere. That eviction notice Diane served you? It's worthless, based on fraudulent documents. You're the legal owner of that house, Gary. You always have been." But even as relief washed over me, I knew this was just the beginning. If Diane had gone this far, if she'd invested this kind of time and money into stealing Margaret's estate, she wasn't going to just give up because I'd discovered the truth. I was right. 2 days later, I came home from the grocery store to find my front door standing wide open. At first I thought I'd been robbed, but nothing was missing. Instead, things had been added. Drug paraphernalia scattered around the living room, empty beer bottles, pornographic magazines spread across Margaret's favorite chair. And in the middle of it all, a note written in block letters. Leave now or everyone will know what kind of man you really are. I called Harold immediately. He called the police. When Officer Martinez arrived to take the report, she walked through the house with a grim expression. Mr. Hartwell, I have to ask, are any of these items actually yours? Absolutely not. My wife just died 3 weeks ago. I don't drink, I don't use drugs, and I sure as hell don't leave pornography lying around her favorite chair. Officer Martinez nodded and started photographing everything. Someone wanted to make you look bad. Question is, who benefits from damaging your reputation? I knew who. But I was learning that knowing and proving were two very different things. The harassment escalated over the next week. Anonymous calls to my neighbors claiming I was dealing drugs out of the house. A fake obituary published in the local paper, claiming Margaret had died estranged from her husband due to his gambling and substance abuse problems. Even a visit from Child Protective Services, investigating a report that I was molesting my own grandchildren. I don't have grandchildren. Margaret and I were never able to have kids. But someone was systematically trying to destroy whatever reputation I had left in the community where I'd lived for nearly 4 decades. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in Margaret's garden trying to find some peace among the roses we'd planted for our 25th anniversary, when my neighbor Tom climbed over the fence between our properties. Tom and I had been friends for 15 years. Our wives had been in the same book club. We'd grilled out together countless summer evenings, shared tools and gossip and the comfortable companionship of good neighbors. Gary, Tom said, and he wouldn't quite look me in the eye. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Of course. Are you selling drugs out of this house? The question hit me like a physical blow. Tom, you've known me for 15 years. Have I ever given you any reason to think I'd... It's just that Diane called my wife yesterday. She's worried about you, Gary. Says Margaret told her you'd been acting strange lately before she died. Staying up all night, having people over at weird hours, being secretive about money. I could see it in Tom's face. He wanted to believe me. But the seed of doubt was already planted. And if Tom, who'd known me for years, could be made to doubt me, then Diane's campaign was working. Tom, Margaret never said any of those things because none of them are true. Diane is lying. Why would she lie about something like that? And there it was, the question I couldn't answer without sounding paranoid, without sounding exactly like the kind of person who might actually be doing the things Diane was claiming. That night I called Harold at home. Harold, she's destroying my reputation. Even my friends are starting to believe her lies. I know, Gary. I've been getting calls too. Someone's been very busy spreading rumors about you all over town. What can we do? Harold was quiet for a long moment. Legally? Not much until we can prove who's behind it. But Gary, I think it's time we went on the offensive. What do you mean? I mean it's time we started digging into Diane's life the same way she's been digging into yours. If she's capable of forging legal documents and orchestrating this kind of character assassination, what else might she be capable of? As I hung up the phone, I realized something had shifted inside me. For weeks, I'd been defending myself against Diane's attacks, reacting to her moves like a chess piece being pushed around the board. But chess is a game for 2 players, and I was tired of letting Diane make all the moves. It was time to start playing offense. Private investigators are expensive. At 64 years old, living on Social Security and Margaret's small pension, I couldn't afford the kind of professional help I really needed. But I could afford something almost as valuable: time, patience, and the burning motivation that comes from righteous anger. I started with public records. Amazing what you can find online these days when you know where to look. Property deeds, court filings, business registrations, marriage and divorce records. It took me 3 weeks of sitting in the public library every day, But I started to piece together a picture of my sister-in-law that I'd never seen before. Diane wasn't just Margaret's grieving sister. She was a woman with serious financial problems. The first red flag was her house. The mansion she and Chuck lived in. The one that had always seemed so far beyond what Chuck made as a mid-level insurance adjuster. I discovered it was mortgaged to the hilt. 3 mortgages, actually. And according to the county records, they were currently 4 months behind on payments. But it got worse. Chuck's insurance business was being investigated by the state regulatory board for fraudulent claims. Diane's boutique clothing store, the one she'd opened 5 years ago with such fanfare, had been hemorrhaging money since day one. They owed back taxes to the IRS, had maxed out credit cards with 5 different banks, and had been sued by creditors 6 times in the past 2 years. These weren't people who were financially stable enough to be concerned about tax implications on Margaret's estate. These were people who were desperate. If you've ever wondered how far desperation can push someone, stay with me. Because what I discovered next showed me that some people will literally steal from the dead to save themselves from bankruptcy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret's hairdresser, Cindy at Hair Today, had been doing Margaret's hair for 12 years. After Margaret got too sick to come to the salon, Cindy started making house calls, a kindness that meant the world to Margaret during those final months. I ran into Cindy at the grocery store, and she grabbed my arm with tears in her eyes. "Gary, I am so sorry about what people are saying about you. It's just wrong." "Thanks, Cindy. It's been rough." I keep thinking about that last day I came to do Margaret's hair, about 3 weeks before she passed. She was so upset about something, kept crying while I was trying to work on her, finally told me what was wrong. My heart started racing. What did she say? She said Diane had been pressuring her to sign some papers, said it was for insurance purposes to make sure you'd be taken care of if something happened to her. But Margaret was confused because the papers looked like they were about the house, not insurance. "Did she sign them?" Cindy shook her head. That's what upset her so much. She said Diane got angry when Margaret asked to have Harold look at the papers first, started yelling at her, saying Margaret didn't trust her own sister, that Margaret was being selfish and paranoid. Margaret felt so guilty about it. But she didn't sign anything? Not while I was there. But Gary, Margaret was so weak by then, so tired. And she hated conflict, especially with family. I worry that Diane might have convinced her later. I thanked Cindy and drove straight to Harold's office. When I told him what I'd learned, his face went white. "Gary, if Margaret never actually signed those papers, then how did they get her signature?" Harold pulled out the divorce documents again, studying Margaret's signature with a magnifying glass. "There are ways. High-quality scanners, digital manipulation, practice, or they could have traced her signature from something else she'd signed." "Something like what?" "Like medical forms. Margaret signed dozens of medical forms in those final months. Insurance authorizations, treatment consents, hospital admissions. Someone with access to those forms would have plenty of examples of her signature to work from. The pieces were falling into place, but I still needed proof. Proof that would hold up in court, not just suspicious coincidences and circumstantial evidence. That's when I remembered Margaret's purse. After she died, I'd put her purse in our bedroom closet, unable to deal with sorting through her personal things. But Margaret was meticulous about keeping receipts, business cards, appointment reminders. Everything went into that purse. I found what I was looking for tucked behind her credit cards, a business card for someone named Bradley Hoffman, with document services printed beneath his name. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, Diane recommended, said he could help with estate planning. I'd never heard Margaret mention any Bradley Hoffman. We'd always used Harold for any legal or estate issues. Why would she be consulting with someone else? Harold ran Hoffman's name through the state licensing database. No results. No Bradley Hoffman licensed to practice law in our state. No business registered under Hoffman Document Services. But the address on the card was real. A small office building downtown. Harold and I decided to pay Mr. Hoffman a visit. The office was exactly what you'd expect from someone running a semi-legal document service. Cheap furniture, outdated computer equipment, and a nervous-looking man in his 50s who started sweating the moment Harold introduced himself as an attorney. "We're here about Margaret Hartwell," Harold said. "I understand she was a client of yours?" Hoffman's eyes darted between us like a cornered animal. "I don't know anyone by that name." Harold placed the business card on Hoffman's desk. "This card was found among her personal effects. Her handwriting indicates you were recommended to her for estate planning services. Look, I run a legitimate business here. I help people with document preparation, that's all. Nothing illegal about it." "Document preparation," Harold repeated. "What kind of documents?" "Legal forms, mostly. Divorce papers, wills, that sort of thing. I don't give legal advice, I just help people fill out the paperwork correctly." "Did you help someone fill out divorce paperwork for Margaret Hartwell?" Hoffman was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed and opened a filing cabinet. "I didn't know the woman personally," he said, pulling out a thin file. "Someone else brought me the information. Said they were helping a sick relative with legal paperwork. Paid cash. I just processed what they gave me." "Who?" Harold and I said simultaneously. Hoffman looked at the file. "Diane Morrison. Said her sister was too sick to handle it herself but needed to protect her husband from medical debt. Seemed like a reasonable situation." "Did you verify that Margaret Hartwell actually wanted a divorce?" "That's not my job. People come here because they need documents prepared quickly and cheaply. I assume they're telling me the truth about their situations." Harold leaned forward. "Mr. Hoffman, you prepared and filed fraudulent divorce documents. That's a federal crime." "I didn't know they were fraudulent. The woman brought me all the information, said her sister had asked her to handle it. She even had medical records showing the sister was in cancer treatment, too sick to come in herself." "Did you witness Margaret Hartwell sign anything?" "No. The signatures were already on the documents when they were brought to me. I just filed them with the court." Harold and I looked at each other. We had him. "Mr. Hoffman, I'm going to need copies of everything in that file, and I strongly suggest you contact your attorney because you're going to be answering some very serious questions about your role in this fraud." As we left Hoffman's office, Harold turned to me. "We've got her, Gary. This is enough to prove the divorce was fraudulent and that Diane orchestrated the whole thing." But I wasn't satisfied yet. Proving the fraud was one thing, understanding why Diane had done it was another, and something told me we were still missing pieces of the puzzle. That afternoon, I called Margaret's oncologist. Dr. Patricia Chen had treated Margaret for 18 months, had seen her through surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, and finally hospice care. If anyone would know about Margaret's mental state in those final months, it would be Dr. Chen. "Mr. Hartwell, I remember Margaret very well. Such a brave woman and so devoted to you. She talked about you constantly. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you about something sensitive. In Margaret's final months, did she ever express any unhappiness with our marriage? Any desire for divorce?" "Quite the opposite. Margaret was concerned about what would happen to you after she was gone. She worried about you being alone, about whether you'd be financially secure. She asked me several times about how long I thought she had because she wanted to make sure everything was arranged properly for you." "Did she ever mention her sister Diane in those conversations?" Dr. Chen paused. "Actually, yes. Margaret was very upset about some conflict with Diane in her final weeks. She didn't go into details, but she said Diane was pressuring her about financial matters and that it was causing her stress during a time when she needed to focus on her health." "What kind of stress?" "Margaret came to an appointment about a month before she died and she'd been crying. She said Diane had accused her of being selfish, of not thinking about the family's needs. Margaret felt terribly guilty about it. She kept saying she didn't want to be a burden on anyone." The picture was becoming clearer. Diane hadn't just been opportunistic when Margaret died. She'd been actively manipulating my dying wife, using Margaret's illness and vulnerability against her. But I still didn't understand the full scope of what Diane had planned. That revelation came 2 days later, when Harold called me with news that made my blood boil. Gary, remember that family trust Margaret inherited from her parents? The one Diane claimed had special tax implications? Yeah. What about it? I've been researching it and I discovered something interesting. When Margaret's parents set up that trust 20 years ago, they made both daughters beneficiaries, but with different terms. What kind of different terms? Margaret inherited her portion outright when her mother died 5 years ago, but Diane's portion was set up differently. She only gets access to the money if she can prove Margaret died without a surviving spouse. The silence on the phone stretched between us as the implications sank in. Harold, are you telling me? I'm telling you that if Diane could prove Margaret was legally divorced when she died, Diane would inherit not just her own trust fund, but Margaret's portion as well. We're talking about almost $400,000, Gary. $400,000. Enough to save Diane's house, pay off her debts, and fund the lifestyle she and Chuck had been living beyond their means. $400,000 in stolen inheritance money, forged legal documents, systematic character assassination. Most people would think that was bad enough. Most people would be satisfied with exposing Diane's crimes and getting their justice in court. But I'm not most people. And what I discovered next made everything else look like child's play. The revelation came from Margaret's medical records. After Harold obtained them through a court order, we spent an afternoon going through every page, every test result, every doctor's note from Margaret's 18 months of treatment. We were looking for anything that might explain how Diane had gotten access to Margaret's signatures, her personal information, her medical status. What we found instead was something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my wife's death. Gary, Harold said, his voice tight with something I couldn't identify. Look at this. He was holding a laboratory report dated 6 weeks before Margaret died. A blood test that showed dangerously high levels of morphine in her system, levels that were inconsistent with the prescribed dosage she was receiving for pain management. What does this mean? Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying the report. It means someone was giving Margaret more morphine than her doctors prescribed. A lot more. The room felt like it was closing in around me. Could it have been an accident? A mistake with her medication? Not according to this. Look at the notation from Dr. Chen. She was concerned enough about these levels that she ordered a second test the next week. But there's no second test in the file. Maybe Margaret refused it? Or maybe someone made sure it never happened. Harold pulled out another document, the hospice care authorization that had been filed 2 weeks before Margaret died. According to this, Margaret's condition had deteriorated rapidly, requiring round-the-clock morphine administration for pain control. But I had been with Margaret every day during that period. She hadn't seemed to be in more pain than usual. If anything, she'd been having some good days, talking about things she wanted to do when she felt stronger. Harold, something's not right about this timeline. I agree, and I think we need to talk to Dr. Chen again. In person this time. Dr. Chen's office was in the medical complex attached to the hospital where Margaret had received most of her treatment. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gentle hands, the type of doctor you instinctively trust with your life. But when Harold showed her the morphine blood test results, her expression changed to something I'd never seen before. I remember this test, she said. I was very concerned about Margaret's morphine levels. But when I tried to follow up, I was told that the family had requested hospice care and that Margaret's pain management would be handled by the hospice team. Who told you that? Harold asked. Margaret's sister, Diane. She said Margaret was embarrassed about the pain she was experiencing and didn't want to worry her husband. She asked me to coordinate directly with the hospice service instead of involving Margaret in any more medical decisions. My hands were shaking. Dr. Chen, Margaret never said anything to me about being embarrassed about her pain. She told me everything. We talked about every aspect of her treatment together. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. That's what I thought was strange about the request. Margaret had always insisted on having you involved in every medical decision. She never made a choice about her treatment without discussing it with you first. But you went along with Diane's request? I'm ashamed to say I did. Diane presented herself as very knowledgeable about Margaret's condition, very concerned about reducing Margaret's stress. She had medical power of attorney documents that appeared to be properly executed. I assumed Margaret had given her authority to make these decisions. Harold and I looked at each other. More forged documents. "Dr. Chen," Harold said carefully, "in your medical opinion, could the high levels of morphine in Margaret's system have contributed to her death? Morphine overdose is certainly possible in cancer patients, especially when multiple caregivers are involved in pain management. The hospice team would have their own protocols, their own dosage schedules. If there was a miscommunication or overlap in medication administration..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "Is there any way to determine if Margaret received more morphine than she should have in those final weeks?" I asked. "Not without an autopsy. And even then, morphine metabolizes quickly. After this much time." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Autopsy. The thought of disturbing Margaret's rest, of putting her through more medical procedures even in death, made me sick. But the alternative was letting Diane get away with... what? Theft? Fraud? Murder? That night I sat in Margaret's garden until well past midnight, trying to make sense of what we'd learned. The October roses were still blooming, their red petals dark as blood in the moonlight. Margaret had loved these roses. She'd planted them herself, tended them through every season, talked to them like they were old friends. Would she want me to disturb her eternal rest to find out the truth? Or would she want me to let her sleep in peace, to move on with my life, and try to find happiness again? I was still wrestling with that decision when I heard a car door slam in front of the house, then footsteps on the front porch, then a key turning in the lock. Someone was inside my house. I slipped through the back door as quietly as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lights were on in the living room, and I could hear voices, hushed but urgent. I recognized them immediately. Diane and Chuck. They were supposed to think I was out of town. I deliberately let it slip to Tom, my neighbor, that I was driving to visit my brother in Columbus for a few days. Word travels fast in a small neighborhood, and I was counting on Diane hearing about it. I crept closer to the living room window, staying in the shadows of Margaret's prize-winning hydrangea bushes. "Have to find it tonight," Diane was saying. "That bastard lawyer is getting too close." Chuck's voice was strained. "Maybe we should just cut our losses, take what we can, and get out of town." "With what money? We're broke, Chuck. This is our only shot." I couldn't see them through the sheer curtains, but I could hear them moving around the room, opening drawers, going through papers. "It has to be here somewhere," Diane muttered. Margaret was old-fashioned. She wouldn't have trusted something this important to a safety deposit box or a lawyer's office. What if she destroyed it? She didn't destroy it. She was too sentimental. But she hid it somewhere Gary wouldn't accidentally find it. They were looking for something. Something Margaret had hidden. Something important enough for Diane to risk breaking into my house to find. I stayed frozen behind those hydrangea bushes for 45 minutes, while they tore apart my living room, my kitchen, Margaret's sewing room. They were systematic about it, careful not to make too much noise, methodical in their search. This wasn't their first time breaking into my house. Finally, Chuck spoke up. "It's not here, Di. We've looked everywhere twice." "Then it's in the bedroom." My bedroom. The bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 37 years. The thought of Diane's hands going through our most private space, touching Margaret's clothes, her jewelry, her personal things, made my vision blur with rage. But I stayed hidden. I stayed quiet. Because I was learning more about what they were really after than I would have learned through months of investigation. "Check the jewelry box first," Diane said. "That's where she used to hide birthday presents when we were kids." I heard drawers opening, the sound of jewelry being moved around. Then Chuck's frustrated voice. "Nothing here but jewelry. Try the closet, behind her dresses." More sounds of searching. Hangers scraping against the closet rod. Boxes being moved. I was clenching my fists so hard my fingernails were drawing blood from my palms. "Wait," Chuck said suddenly. What about this? What? This shoebox, it's heavier than the others. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. Then Diane's voice, triumphant and cold. That's it. That's what we need. Are you sure? I'm sure. This is what she used to blackmail us into keeping quiet about the morphine. Blackmail. Morphine. The words hit me like physical blows. I still think we should have handled this differently, Chuck said. How? Let her live long enough to tell Gary what we'd been doing? Let her ruin us out of some misguided sense of loyalty to that pathetic husband of hers? The truth was spreading through me like poison. They hadn't just stolen from Margaret. They hadn't just forged documents and filed fraudulent divorce papers. They had killed her. She was dying anyway, Diane continued, and her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. The cancer would have taken her in another few months. All we did was make it easier for her, more peaceful. Peaceful, Chuck repeated, but he didn't sound convinced. She didn't suffer, Chuck. The extra morphine just made her sleep more, and it solved all our problems. Her medical bills stopped draining the estate. We got access to the insurance money faster, and she didn't have time to figure out what we'd been doing with her finances. But if Gary finds out, Gary's not going to find out anything. After tonight, there's no evidence left. And without evidence, he's just a grieving widower making wild accusations against his dead wife's family. They were moving toward the front door. I heard the shoebox being carried out, heard the lock being turned, heard their car doors slam, and the engine start. I stayed in those bushes until their taillights disappeared down the street. Then I stayed there for another hour, just breathing, just trying to process what I'd heard. Margaret hadn't died from cancer. She'd been murdered. Slowly, deliberately, over the course of several weeks, with extra doses of morphine administered by the people she trusted most. And she'd known. That shoebox, whatever was in it, had been Margaret's insurance policy, her way of protecting herself from the people who were supposed to love her. But it hadn't been enough to save her life. I went inside and called Harold from the kitchen phone. It was almost 2 a.m, but I didn't care. Harold, they killed her. Diane and Chuck killed Margaret. Gary, slow down. What happened? I told him everything. About the break-in, the conversation I'd overheard, the shoebox Diane had taken. Harold listened without interrupting, and when I finished, the silence on his end was deafening. Harold, are you there? I'm here. Gary, what you're telling me, if it's true, this is first-degree murder, but without that shoebox, without whatever evidence Margaret had gathered, then we get it back. How? I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded when I answered. I'm going to make them give it to me. Gary, you can't just... I can't let them get away with this, Harold. They murdered my wife. They stole her money. They tried to destroy my reputation and run me out of my own home. And they did it all while pretending to be the grieving family members. I understand your anger, but we have to be smart about this. We have to... I hung up the phone. Being smart had gotten me nowhere. Being patient had let them steal 4 months of my life while they covered their tracks and destroyed evidence. Being reasonable had allowed them to murder Margaret and make it look like natural causes. It was time to stop being smart. It was time to start being dangerous. The next morning I drove to Diane's house. Not to confront her. Not yet. Just to watch. To learn her patterns, her routines, her vulnerabilities. If you've ever been pushed to the point where you realized you were capable of things you never thought possible, you know exactly what I was feeling that morning. Sometimes the line between justice and revenge isn't as clear as we'd like to think. And sometimes good people have to do bad things to stop evil people from doing worse things. Make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is turned on, because what I did next crossed lines I'd never thought I'd cross. But when someone murders the person you love most in the world, when they steal everything you have left of them, when they try to destroy your memory of them and your place in the world, well, that's when you discover what you're really made of. I spent 3 days watching Diane's house, learning that she left every morning at 9:15 to go to her failing boutique. that Chuck went to work at 7:30 and didn't come home until after 6, that they had a housekeeper who came on Tuesdays and Fridays, that Diane always stopped at the coffee shop on Maple Street before going to work. On Thursday morning, I followed her to that coffee shop, watched her order her usual, large vanilla latte with an extra shot of espresso, watched her sit at her usual table by the window, checking emails on her phone while she drank her coffee. I waited until she went to the bathroom. Then I walked in, sat down at her table, and waited for her to come back. The look on her face when she saw me was worth everything I'd been through. Pure shock followed by fear, followed by that cold calculation I'd come to know so well. "Gary, what are you doing here?" "Waiting for you, Diane. We need to have a conversation." She glanced around the coffee shop, noting the other customers, probably calculating whether I'd cause a scene in public. "I don't have anything to say to you." "That's fine. You can just listen." I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and conversational. "I know about the morphine, Diane. I know you killed Margaret." Her face went white, but she recovered quickly. "You're insane. Margaret died of cancer. Margaret died of a morphine overdose that you administered. I know about the fake hospice authorization. I know about the forged medical power of attorney. And I know you took something from my house 2 nights ago. Something Margaret had hidden to protect herself from you." Diane's hand was trembling as she reached for her coffee cup. "You can't prove any of that." "I can prove all of it. The question is whether I prove it to the police first or to the newspapers. What do you want?" "I want the shoebox back. I want a written confession. And I want you to disappear from my life forever." Diane stared at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, the same cold smile she'd given me at Margaret's funeral. "You're bluffing. If you had real evidence, you would have already gone to the police. You're just a pathetic old man making desperate accusations because you can't accept that your wife wanted to leave you." She stood up to go, and that's when I played my final card. "Sit down, Diane. Because if you walk away from this table, the first call I make is to your creditors. Did you know that insurance fraud investigators are very interested in unusual death benefit claims? Especially when the deceased's medical records show unexplained drug levels right before death?" She sat back down. "The second call I make is to the IRS. I'm sure they'd love to audit someone who's been living far beyond their reported income for the past 5 years. Her face was getting redder with each word. "And the third call is to Channel 7 News. I bet they'd be very interested in a story about a woman who murdered her dying sister for inheritance money, especially when I show them the forged divorce documents and the fake medical authorizations." "You son of a bitch." "The shoebox, Diane. Tonight. Or tomorrow morning, your life becomes a very public nightmare." I left her sitting there in that coffee shop staring into her vanilla latte like she could find answers in the foam. That evening, my doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. When I opened the door, Diane was standing on my front porch holding a shoebox. Behind her, Chuck sat in their car with the engine running, ready for a quick getaway. She looked like she'd aged 10 years since our coffee shop conversation that morning. "Here's your precious box," she said, shoving it at me. "I hope you're satisfied." But I didn't take it. Not yet. "I want to hear you say it first." "Say what?" "I want to hear you admit what you did to Margaret." Diane glanced back at Chuck, then at me. For a moment I thought she was going to refuse. Then something in her face crumbled, and I saw not the cold, calculating woman who'd been tormenting me for months, but a desperate, cornered animal. "We needed the money," she whispered. Margaret was going to live for months, maybe years. The medical bills were eating up everything. Chuck's business was failing. We were going to lose the house. So you decided to speed things along. It wasn't supposed to be murder. We were just helping her transition more peacefully. The morphine made her comfortable. She wasn't suffering. She was suffering because you were killing her. Diane's voice rose, losing control. She was dying anyway. The cancer was going to take her, Gary. All we did was make it easier, quicker, less painful for everyone involved. Less painful for everyone, Or just more profitable for you? Both. Yes, both. Margaret would have wanted us to be taken care of. She would have understood. I could see Chuck getting agitated in the car, probably worried that Diane was saying too much, too loudly. Some of my neighbors had porch lights on, and voices carry in the cool October air. "Give me the box, Diane." She thrust it at me with shaking hands. "It's all there. Everything she wrote down, every photo she took, every recording she made. The paranoid bitch was documenting everything we did." Recording. Margaret had been making recordings. "How long did she know what you were doing?" "About 3 weeks before she died. She started getting suspicious when she felt drowsy all the time, when she couldn't remember conversations we'd had. She set up that little digital recorder by her bedside, started keeping track of when people visited her, what medications she was given." 3 weeks. Margaret had known for 3 weeks that her own sister was slowly murdering her, and she'd spent that time gathering evidence instead of stopping it. Why hadn't she called the police? Why hadn't she told me? Why didn't she turn you in? Diane's laugh was bitter and ugly. Because she still loved us. Even knowing what we were doing, she still wanted to protect the family. She said she'd keep quiet about the morphine if we stopped, if we promised to take care of you after she was gone. But you didn't stop. We couldn't stop, don't you understand? We were in too deep by then. The forged documents were already filed. The insurance policies were already in motion. If Margaret had lived long enough to expose what we'd done, we would have gone to prison. So you killed her to save yourselves. We made sure she didn't suffer, Diane said, but her voice was hollow now, like she didn't believe her own words anymore. I took the shoebox from her hands. It was heavier than I'd expected, packed full of whatever evidence Margaret had managed to gather in those final 3 weeks of her life. "Diane," I said, and my voice was steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "I want you and Chuck to leave town. Tonight. Pack whatever you can fit in your car and drive as far away from here as you can get." "What?" "Because tomorrow morning I'm taking this box to the police, and the day after that I'm taking copies of everything to every newspaper and TV station in the state. You've got maybe a 12-hour head start before every law enforcement agency in the country is looking for you. You can't." "I can do whatever I want, Diane. You murdered my wife. You tried to steal everything she left behind. You spent months trying to destroy my reputation and drive me out of my own home. The only reason I'm giving you this head start is because Margaret apparently still loved you, even after she knew what you were doing to her." Diane stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to decide whether I was bluffing again. Then she saw something in my face that convinced her I was dead serious. "Gary, please, we can work something out. We can—" 12 hours, Diane. Then I make those phone calls." She stumbled back to the car, got in beside Chuck, and they drove away into the darkness. I stood on my front porch for a long time after their taillights disappeared, holding Margaret's shoebox like it contained the secrets of the universe. In a way it did. Inside my house, I sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast together every morning for 37 years, and I opened the box. The first thing I found was a letter addressed to me in Margaret's handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. "My dearest Gary," it began. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've discovered what Diane and Chuck have been doing. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you while I was still alive. I'm so sorry I couldn't find a way to stop them without destroying our family. Our family. Even knowing that her sister was murdering her, Margaret had still thought of Diane as family. I know you must be angry with me for keeping this secret," the letter continued, "but I couldn't bear the thought of you living with guilt if something happened to them because of me. Diane is still my little sister, no matter what she's done. And Chuck is weak, but he's not evil. Not like this. She's pushed him into something he doesn't have the strength to resist." I had to stop reading for a moment. Margaret, dying by inches from the morphine her sister was feeding her, had still been trying to protect everyone else. Still been trying to hold the family together. Still been thinking about my feelings and my guilt rather than her own survival. I've been documenting everything, the letter went on, but I'm not sure how much time I have left. The drowsiness is getting worse, and I'm having trouble staying awake long enough to write coherent thoughts. If something happens to me, if I don't recover from this illness, please know that I love you more than life itself. Please know that every day with you has been a gift. The letter was dated 5 days before Margaret died. 5 days when she'd known she was being murdered, when she could have saved herself by picking up the phone and calling 911, but instead she'd chosen to protect the people who were killing her. The rest of the box contained exactly what Diane had described. Photos of pill bottles and medication schedules. Handwritten notes tracking when Diane and Chuck visited, how Margaret felt afterward, which medications they brought. Digital recordings of conversations where Diane pressured Margaret to sign documents or discussed Margaret's deteriorating condition with Chuck. And buried at the bottom of the box, a small digital recorder with Margaret's weak voice whispering into it. Day 18 since I started tracking this. Diane came by today with more of the morphine patches. Said Dr. Chen had increased my dosage again, but when I called to ask about side effects, Dr. Chen's nurse said there was no record of any dosage increase. Diane got angry when I told her this, said I was being paranoid and ungrateful, said she was only trying to help manage my pain. I had to pause the recording, hearing Margaret's voice again, hearing her confusion and fear and desperate love for her sister even as that sister slowly killed her, was almost unbearable. Day 21. Chuck came by while you were at the grocery store. He seemed nervous, kept looking around like he expected someone to catch him doing something wrong. He brought another bottle of liquid morphine, said it was just in case the patches weren't strong enough. Gary, I'm scared. I think they're trying to. I can't even write the words. But if something happens to me, please know it wasn't natural. Please know I fought as long as I could. The final recording was dated the day before Margaret died. I don't think I have much time left. The drowsiness is constant now, and I can barely hold this recorder steady. Diane was here again today. She asked if I'd finished signing those papers she brought, the ones about the house and the insurance. I told her I needed to wait for Harold to look at them first. She got so angry, Gary. Angrier than I've ever seen her. She said I was being selfish, that I wasn't thinking about what would happen to the family if I didn't take care of these things properly. Margaret's voice was getting weaker, more slurred. She brought more morphine, said it would help me sleep peacefully. I pretended to take it, but I hid it under my pillow instead. I'm going to try to stay awake tonight, try to think of what to do. Gary, if you find this, please don't hate me for not telling you. I couldn't bear to destroy what was left of our family. I love you. I love you so much. Take care of yourself. Try to find happiness again. That was the last recording. I sat in that kitchen until the sun came up, listening to Margaret's voice, reading her notes, studying the evidence she'd gathered while her sister slowly murdered her. By the time Harold arrived at 8 o'clock, I'd called him at dawn. I knew exactly what I was going to do. Gary, you look like hell. Did you sleep at all? Harold, I need you to call the police. I need you to call the district attorney's office. And I need you to call every media outlet you can think of. I showed him the contents of the shoebox, watched his face go pale as he read Margaret's letter, listened to her recordings, examined her meticulous documentation of her own murder. Jesus Christ, Gary, this is a prosecutor's dream. This is enough evidence to put them away for life. Good, because I want them to pay for every single day of suffering they put Margaret through. Harold was already reaching for his phone when I stopped him. But first, I want to tell you what I did last night. I want to tell you about the choice I made. I told Harold about confronting Diane, about the 12-hour head start I'd given them, about watching them drive away into the darkness. Harold stared at me in disbelief. Gary, you let them escape. They could be anywhere by now. I know. Why? Why would you give them the chance to run? I picked up Margaret's letter, held it carefully in my hands like the precious thing it was. Because Margaret asked me to, Not in so many words, but in every word she wrote. She loved them, Harold. Even knowing they were killing her, she still loved them. She still wanted to protect them. And her dying wish was for me to take care of myself, to find happiness again. So you let her murderers go free? No. I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. Harold looked confused. What do you mean? I smiled for the first time in months. A cold smile that would have made Diane proud. I mean, I know where they're going, Harold. And I know they're not smart enough to disappear properly. Within a week, they'll make a mistake. They'll use a credit card or call a family member or get pulled over for speeding. And when they do, every law enforcement agency in the country will be waiting for them. How can you be so sure? Because I've been planning for this moment for months. Do you really think I'd confront Diane without having a backup plan? I showed Harold the small GPS tracking device I'd attached to Chuck's car while they were in the coffee shop that morning. The device that had been broadcasting their location to my phone for the past 12 hours. They drove to a motel outside Cincinnati, I said. Paid cash, checked in under fake names, but they're driving a car that's registered to them and sending out a GPS signal every 30 seconds. Harold stared at the tracking app on my phone, watching the little dot that represented Chuck's car sitting motionless in a motel parking lot 200 miles away. Gary, that's brilliant. And slightly terrifying. I've had a lot of time to think about this, Harold. A lot of time to plan exactly how I wanted this to end. What happens now? Now we call the police. We give them all of Margaret's evidence. We tell them exactly where to find Diane and Chuck. And we watch justice finally catch up with the people who murdered my wife. But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't really about justice. Not anymore. This was about revenge. Cold, calculated, patient revenge. And Margaret, despite her gentle nature and forgiving heart, had given me everything I needed to destroy the people who'd destroyed her. The phone call came at 3 a.m, exactly 1 week after I'd turned Margaret's evidence over to the police. Mr. Hartwell, this is Detective Morrison with the Cincinnati Police Department. We found your vehicle tracking device very helpful in locating the suspects you reported. I was instantly awake. You arrested them? Well, that's why I'm calling. We found the vehicle, but the suspects weren't with it. The car was abandoned in a Walmart parking lot with the GPS device still attached. Security cameras showed 2 individuals removing luggage from the vehicle around midnight, but they were wearing hoodies and kept their faces hidden. They'd found the tracker. Somehow Diane and Chuck had discovered my GPS device and abandoned their car. Any idea where they went from there? We're checking bus stations, rental car agencies, taxi companies, but Mr. Hartwell, I have to ask, how exactly did you manage to place a tracking device on the suspect's vehicle? That's a pretty sophisticated move for a civilian. I'd been expecting this question. Detective, my wife was murdered by these people. They spent months terrorizing me, trying to steal my home, destroying my reputation in the community where I've lived for 40 years. Let's just say I was motivated to learn some new skills. Detective Morrison chuckled. Fair enough. Well, we've issued a nationwide APB. Between the evidence you provided and the media coverage this case is getting, they won't be able to hide for long. Media coverage. That was putting it mildly. The story had exploded across every news outlet in the state within hours of the police press conference. Sister accused of murdering cancer patient for inheritance. Forged documents, insurance fraud, and murder. The dying woman who recorded her own murder. Margaret's voice, weak, frightened, but determined to document the truth, had been played on every television and radio station. Her handwritten notes had been photographed and shared across social media. Her story had touched something deep in the public consciousness. By the end of the week, there was a $50,000 reward for information leading to Diane and Chuck's capture. Half of it put up by the state, the other half crowdfunded by strangers who'd been moved by Margaret's story. My phone had been ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, producers wanting movie rights, true crime podcasters wanting exclusive access. I'd turned them all down. This wasn't about fame or money or my 15 minutes in the spotlight. This was about making sure Diane and Chuck never had another peaceful day for the rest of their lives. The first confirmed sighting came from a truck stop in Tennessee. A cashier recognized Diane from the news coverage and called police, but by the time officers arrived, they were gone again. Security footage showed them getting into a different vehicle, a beat-up sedan with Georgia plates. "They're running scared," Harold told me over coffee 2 days later. "Changing vehicles, using cash, staying off the main highways, but they can't keep this up forever." "They're not as smart as they think they are," I agreed. "Diane's used to manipulating people face to face, using her charm and her lies to get what she wants. Chuck's never been anything but a follower. Neither of them has the skills to disappear completely." "What makes you so confident?" I pulled out my phone and showed Harold the Facebook page I'd been monitoring. "Diane's not as clever as she thinks. She can't resist social media." Harold stared at the screen. It was Chuck's Facebook account, which hadn't been updated since they'd fled. But I'd been tracking the account's login activity through some less-than-legal means I'd learned from a private investigator friend. "Someone's been logging into Chuck's Facebook account every few days," I explained. "Just for a few minutes at a time, probably to check messages or see what people are saying about them. But every login creates a digital footprint." "Can you trace where they're logging in from?" "Not exactly. They're probably using public Wi-Fi, internet cafes, libraries. But I can track the general geographic area, and I can see what they're looking at while they're online." Harold leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What are they looking at?" "News coverage about their case mostly. But also," I scrolled through the login data. "They've been researching fake identity documents, how to get new social security numbers, countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. They're planning to leave the country. They're thinking about it, but they need money for that kind of disappearing act. Real money, not just whatever cash they grabbed when they ran." And that's when I realized what their next move would be. The storage unit was in Diane's maiden name, registered to an address she'd used 15 years ago, when she first got divorced from her first husband. I'd found it by accident while going through old family photos Margaret had kept. A business card, from LA Storage, tucked behind a picture of Diane's wedding. Harold thought I was grasping at straws, but I convinced him to drive out there with me anyway. The facility was on the outskirts of town, one of those places where people store furniture they don't need and Christmas decorations they only use once a year. Unit 47B was locked with a combination padlock that looked newer than the others. "Gary, we can't just break into someone's storage unit. That's breaking and entering." "Technically, it's still breaking and entering when they do it too. The difference is they murdered someone." I'd brought bolt cutters. It took 30 seconds to cut through the padlock. Inside the storage unit, we found exactly what I'd hoped we'd find. And exactly what I'd feared we'd find. Boxes of financial documents. Bank statements, investment portfolios, insurance policies. All in Margaret's name. All showing transactions and changes that had been made without my knowledge during Margaret's final months. Margaret's estate wasn't worth just the house and a small life insurance policy like I'd thought. Diane and Chuck had been systematically looting Margaret's accounts for over a year, transferring money into offshore accounts, cashing in investments, even borrowing against the life insurance policies. "Jesus, Gary, look at this." Harold was holding a bank statement showing Margaret's savings account. The account that should have had $43,000 in it when she died. The final balance was $12.37. They'd stolen everything. Not just the inheritance money from the family trust, but Margaret's entire life savings. Money she'd earned from 30 years of teaching school. Money we'd saved for retirement, for emergencies, for the future we'd thought we'd have together. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the insurance policies. 5 different life insurance policies on Margaret's life, all taken out within 6 months of her cancer diagnosis. All with Chuck and Diane listed as beneficiaries. They hadn't just murdered Margaret for the inheritance money. They'd been planning her death from the moment she was diagnosed. "Harold, do you see what this means?" "It means they're facing federal charges now. Wire fraud, insurance fraud, interstate transportation of stolen property. We're talking about life in prison. No, Harold. It means they're desperate, really desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at the old quarry on Route 7 tonight at midnight. Come alone, or Gary dies too. It was from Diane. Harold grabbed my phone. Gary, you are not going to meet them. This is obviously a trap. Of course it's a trap, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to get yourself killed. An opportunity to end this once and for all. I was already planning what I'd need to bring, how I'd handle the confrontation, what evidence I wanted to get from them before the police arrived. Gary, listen to me. These people murdered your wife. They've stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. They have nothing left to lose. If you meet them tonight, they will kill you. Maybe. Or maybe they're finally ready to deal. Harold stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Deal? What kind of deal could you possibly want to make with your wife's murderers? The kind of deal where they confess everything on video, where they tell me exactly how they killed Margaret, exactly why they did it, exactly how long they'd been planning it. The kind of deal where I get closure. And then what? You let them go? I smiled, and Harold actually took a step back from me. Then I decide whether they deserve to spend the rest of their lives in prison, or whether they deserve something worse. Harold was shaking his head. Gary, you're scaring me. This isn't you. This isn't who you are. You're right, Harold. 6 months ago, this wasn't who I was. 6 months ago, I was a grieving widower who just wanted to mourn his wife in peace. But that was before I found out she was murdered, before I found out her own sister had been slowly poisoning her while pretending to care, before I found out they'd been planning her death since the day she was diagnosed with cancer. I picked up one of the insurance policies, held it up so Harold could see the date it was issued. This policy was taken out 3 days after Margaret's first oncology appointment, Harold. 3 days. They heard cancer and immediately started planning how to profit from her death. They turned my wife's illness into a business opportunity. So let the justice system handle it. Let them go to trial. Let a jury convict them. Let them spend the rest of their lives in prison. The justice system? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The justice system that let them forge legal documents for months without anyone noticing? The system that let them file fraudulent insurance claims and transfer money out of a dying woman's accounts without raising any red flags? The system that would have let them get away with murder if I hadn't stumbled across the truth? Harold was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. If you're determined to do this, at least let me help. Let me call the police, have them set up surveillance at the quarry. No. If they see police, they'll run again, and this time they might actually manage to disappear. Then let me come with you. No, Harold, this is personal. This is between me and the people who murdered Margaret. I left Harold standing in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of everything Diane and Chuck had stolen from my wife. As I drove home to prepare for the midnight meeting, I thought about Margaret's final recording, about her voice getting weaker as her sister slowly poisoned her to death. Try to find happiness again, she'd whispered. Well, Margaret, I thought, maybe this is what happiness looks like for me now. Maybe happiness is making sure the people who destroyed you never hurt anyone else. The old quarry on Route 7 had been abandoned since I was a teenager. Local kids used to go swimming there in the summers before the state declared it too dangerous and fenced it off. But the fence had been cut and recut so many times over the years that it was more suggestion than barrier. I arrived at 11:30, early enough to scout the area but late enough that I wouldn't be sitting there like a target for too long. The quarry was a bowl, carved out of limestone, filled with dark water that reflected the October moon like a broken mirror. Perfect place for a murder, really. Remote, quiet, with convenient disposal methods for inconvenient bodies. I parked my truck behind a stand of pine trees and walked the perimeter of the quarry, checking for signs that Diane and Chuck were already there, looking for potential escape routes if things went badly. The place felt empty, but appearances can be deceiving. At exactly midnight, I heard a car engine approaching. Headlights swept across the quarry as an old sedan pulled up to the edge of the water. The same beat-up car from the Tennessee truck stop security footage. Two figures got out, Diane and Chuck, looking like they'd been living rough for the past week. Diane's expensive clothes were wrinkled and dirty. Chuck needed a shave and looked like he'd lost 20 pounds from stress. I stepped out from behind the pine trees. "Hello, Diane." She spun around, and I could see the gun in her hand before she tried to hide it behind her back. "Gary, thank you for coming. Thank you for finally being honest about what you are." Chuck was hanging back by the car, clearly uncomfortable with this whole confrontation. "Di, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Chuck." Diane's voice had the same cold authority it had carried at Margaret's funeral. "Gary, we need to discuss terms." "Terms for what?" "Terms for making this whole mess go away. You've caused us a lot of trouble, Gary. A lot of expensive trouble." I almost laughed. "I've caused you trouble? You murdered my wife, Diane. You stole everything she worked for her entire life. You tried to frame her as a woman who wanted to leave her husband. And I've caused you trouble? Margaret was dying anyway, You just decided to speed things along so you could get your hands on her money faster." I took a step closer and Diane raised the gun. "How long had you been planning it, Diane? How long had you been waiting for Margaret to get sick so you could kill her?" "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Chuck spoke up, his voice weak and shaky. "We were just going to borrow some money from her accounts, pay it back when my business turned around." "But then the cancer gave you a better idea," I said. "Why pay the money back when you could just wait for Margaret to die naturally and inherit it all?" "Except she wasn't dying fast enough," Diane said, and there was no remorse in her voice. "The doctor said she might have years left, years of expensive treatments, years of medical bills eating up the estate we couldn't afford to wait. So you started poisoning her. We started managing her pain more aggressively. There's a difference. The difference is intent, Diane, and your intent was murder." Diane's grip on the gun tightened. "My intent was survival, Gary. You have no idea what it's like to watch everything you've worked for slip away, to know that bankruptcy and homelessness are just around the corner. You're right. I don't know what that's like, because I never murdered anyone to avoid it." "Well, maybe you should have. Maybe if you'd been a stronger man, a more successful man, Margaret wouldn't have been so eager to help us out financially." There it was. Even now, even caught red-handed, Diane was trying to make this my fault somehow. "Margaret wasn't eager to help you, Diane. You manipulated her. You used her illness against her, made her feel guilty for not signing your forged documents. Those documents were legitimate estate planning tools. Those documents were forgeries designed to steal a dying woman's money." My voice echoed across the quarry, startling a nightbird into flight. "I found your storage unit, Diane. I found all of it. The bank statements, the insurance policies, the offshore accounts. I know about every penny you stole from Margaret." Diane's face went white in the moonlight. "You had no right to break into our property." "Your property? You mean the storage unit you rented under a false name to hide evidence of your crimes? The storage unit full of documents showing how you systematically looted my wife's accounts while she was dying?" Chuck was backing toward the car. "Di, he knows everything. We should just go. We should just run and keep running." "We can't run forever, Chuck. We don't have the money to disappear properly, and thanks to Gary here, every cop in the country is looking for us." She turned back to me and I could see the calculation in her eyes, the cold, predatory intelligence that had allowed her to slowly murder her own sister while maintaining the facade of a loving family member. "Here's what's going to happen, Gary. You're going to call your lawyer friend and tell him you made a mistake. Tell him you were grief-stricken and paranoid, that you misinterpreted some things you found among Margaret's belongings. Tell him the evidence you turned over to the police was unreliable." "And why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, I'm going to put a bullet in your head and dump your body in this quarry. Chuck and I will disappear, and eventually the heat will die down. But you'll be dead, and Margaret will be dead, and we'll still have gotten away with everything." I looked at the gun in her hand. at the desperation in her eyes, at Chuck cowering by the car, like the weak man he'd always been. "There's just one problem with your plan, Diane." "What's that?" "Margaret's not actually dead." The silence that followed my words was so complete I could hear the water lapping against the limestone walls of the quarry. "What did you say?" Diane's voice was barely a whisper. "Margaret. She's not dead. She's in protective custody, recovering from the morphine poisoning you put her through. Turns out, when you give someone too much morphine, sometimes they slip into a coma that looks like death, especially if their vitals are already weak from cancer treatments." Diane's gun hand was shaking now. "You're lying." "Am I? How do you think I knew to look for that storage unit, Diane? How do you think I knew about the offshore accounts, the insurance policies, the systematic theft of Margaret's savings? The recordings, the evidence in the shoebox, were all part of an elaborate sting operation designed to get you to confess to attempted murder and grand theft. Margaret's been working with the FBI for months, documenting your crimes, building a case that would put you away forever. Of course, this was all a lie. Margaret was dead, buried in the cemetery where Diane had first threatened me. But in the darkness, with adrenaline and fear clouding their judgment, it was a lie that Diane and Chuck might actually believe, at least long enough for the real FBI agents I'd called 3 hours ago to arrive. "You're lying," Diane said again, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "The funeral was fake, Diane. A closed casket ceremony with an empty box. Margaret's been in witness protection, recovering her strength, waiting for you to make exactly this kind of mistake." Chuck was staring at me in horror. "Oh God, Di. Oh God, what have we done?" "Shut up, Chuck. He's lying. Margaret's dead. We watched them lower the casket into the ground." "Did you? Or did you watch them lower an empty box into a hole while Margaret was secretly recording your reaction from a surveillance van?" I pulled out my phone, showed them the screen. "She's listening right now, Diane. Margaret can hear every word you're saying." The phone screen was blank, of course, but in the moonlight from 20 feet away, Diane couldn't see that. "Margaret," Diane called out, her voice breaking. "Margaret, are you there?" I held the phone closer to my mouth. "She says hello, Diane. She says she forgives you for trying to kill her, but she doesn't forgive you for making her funeral so sad." That's when Chuck broke. "I'm sorry," he screamed into the darkness. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. It was Diane's idea. All of it was Diane's idea. I never wanted to hurt you." "Chuck, shut up." Diane spun toward him, the gun now pointing at her own husband. "He's lying. Margaret's dead. We killed her." And there it was. The confession I'd been hoping for, recorded on the very real digital recorder I had hidden in my jacket pocket. "We killed her, Chuck. We murdered my own sister for her money, and if Gary thinks he can just—" The gunshot echoed across the quarry like thunder, but it wasn't Diane who pulled the trigger. FBI agent Sarah Chen stepped out from behind the same pine trees where I'd been hiding earlier, her service weapon smoking in the moonlight. "Drop your weapon, FBI." Diane looked down at the spreading red stain on her chest, then at the gun that had fallen from her suddenly nerveless fingers. "But she's dead," Diane whispered, falling to her knees. "Margaret's dead. We made sure she was dead." "Yes, ma'am, she is," Agent Chen said, keeping her weapon trained on Chuck, who had collapsed in a sobbing heap by the car. "And you just confessed to murdering her." As the FBI agents secured the scene and called for ambulances, I walked to the edge of the quarry and looked down into the dark water. Margaret was dead. She'd been dead for months. But tonight, in this place with her murderers finally caught and confessed, it felt like she was finally at peace. And for the first time since her funeral, so was I. The trial lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of listening to prosecutors detail every aspect of how Diane and Chuck had systematically murdered my wife. 6 weeks of evidence that painted a picture of greed, manipulation, and betrayal so thorough it made national news. Diane survived the gunshot. Agent Chen had aimed to disable, not kill. but she spent the first month of trial proceedings in a wheelchair, wearing Orange County jail scrubs instead of her usual expensive outfits. The contrast was striking. Gone was the cold, controlling woman who'd tried to evict me from my own home. In her place sat a broken, desperate person who seemed to shrink a little more each day as the evidence mounted against her. Chuck, meanwhile, had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy charges in exchange for his testimony against Diane. He took the stand on day 4 of the trial and told the jury everything. How Diane had first suggested borrowing money from Margaret's accounts when Chuck's insurance business started failing. How she'd convinced him it wasn't really stealing because they'd pay it back eventually. How the borrowing had escalated into systematic theft when they realized Margaret might live for years with her cancer. She said Margaret was suffering, Chuck testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. She said we were being merciful, helping her transition peacefully. But I knew what we were really doing. And what were you really doing, Mr. Morrison? The prosecutor asked. We were killing her, slowly, with the extra morphine, because we needed her to die before she figured out what we'd stolen from her. The courtroom was dead silent as Chuck broke down on the witness stand. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, staring at this man who was confessing to murdering a cancer patient for money. But the most damning evidence came from Margaret herself. The prosecution played every one of Margaret's secret recordings. Her weak voice filled the courtroom as she documented her own murder, day by day, dose by dose. The jury, 12 ordinary people who'd never imagined such calculated evil could exist, listened with horror as Margaret described her growing suspicions, her physical deterioration, her desperate attempts to gather evidence while her sister slowly poisoned her to death. The defense attorney tried to argue that Margaret had been delusional from pain medication, that her recordings were the paranoid fantasies of a dying woman. But the medical evidence contradicted that strategy. Blood tests, hospital records, pharmaceutical receipts, everything corroborated Margaret's account of being systematically overdosed with morphine. By the 3rd week of trial, even Diane's lawyer was going through the motions. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession at the quarry was clear and unambiguous. The financial records showed obvious theft and fraud. There was no reasonable doubt about what had happened. On day 37 of the trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, wire fraud, grand theft. Diane Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chuck Morrison was sentenced to 30 years, with the possibility of parole after 25. If you've been following this story, wondering whether justice would ever be served, whether the people who destroyed Margaret would ever pay for what they did, well, that day in court, watching the judge read those sentences, was the closest thing to closure I thought I'd ever get. But I was wrong. The real closure came 3 months later, in a place I never expected. I was visiting Margaret's grave on what would have been our 38th wedding anniversary. I'd brought roses from her garden, the October roses that had somehow survived the first frost and were still blooming, still defying the approach of winter. As I arranged the flowers on Margaret's headstone, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Harold approaching, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. "Gary, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know right away." "Know what?" Harold handed me the folder. "The civil lawsuit against Diane and Chuck's estate has been settled. Everything they stole from Margaret, everything they hid in offshore accounts, everything they tried to keep from you, it's all been recovered." I opened the folder and stared at the numbers. Margaret's savings account had been fully restored. The insurance policies they'd fraudulently taken out on her life had been voided, but the legitimate policies, the ones Margaret and I had purchased together years ago, had finally been paid out. Even the money they'd borrowed against the house had been recovered from hidden accounts. "How much?" "All of it, Gary. Every penny they stole, plus interest and penalties. You're looking at close to $500,000. $500,000. More money than Margaret and I had ever dreamed of having. There's more," Harold continued. The state is offering a settlement for the fraudulent divorce proceedings. Apparently, the clerk who processed Diane's forged documents has been doing this kind of thing for years. The state wants to settle quietly to avoid a public scandal. How much are they offering? Another 100,000. I looked down at Margaret's headstone, at the roses I'd brought from her garden, at the simple words carved in bronze. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved wife. Harold, I don't want their money. Gary, you've been through hell. You deserve compensation for what they put you through. I don't want compensation. I want something else. What? I want to do something Margaret would be proud of. Something that would honor her memory and help other people who might be going through what she went through. Over the next 6 months, I used Margaret's recovered money to establish the Margaret Hartwell Foundation for Elder Abuse Prevention. The foundation funds legal aid for elderly victims of financial fraud, supports medical advocacy programs in cancer treatment centers, and provides resources for families dealing with end-of-life care. We also lobbied for legislation requiring additional oversight of medical power of attorney documents and mandatory reporting of unusual death benefit claims. The Margaret's Law package passed the state legislature unanimously and has since been adopted in 12 other states. But the work that means the most to me personally is the Survivor Support Program. Every month I meet with families who've been through experiences similar to mine. People who've discovered that their loved ones were being financially exploited, medically abused, or emotionally manipulated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. People who've learned that elder abuse doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from family members who see opportunity and vulnerability. Last month, I worked with a woman whose brother had been stealing from their mother's dementia care fund. The month before that, it was a man whose daughter-in-law had been forging his wife's prescription medications. Each case is different, but the pattern is always the same. Trusted family members exploiting illness, age, or disability for personal gain. We help these families navigate the legal system, connect with appropriate law enforcement agencies, and most importantly, find ways to heal from the betrayal. Because that's what this kind of crime really is, betrayal. The violation of trust between people who are supposed to love and protect each other. It's been 2 years since Margaret died. 2 years since I discovered she was murdered. 2 years since I started this journey that took me from grief to rage to revenge to something resembling justice. Diane is serving her life sentence in a maximum security women's prison 3 hours from here. According to reports I received from the Department of Corrections, she's not adapting well to prison life. She's been placed in protective custody twice after conflicts with other inmates, and she's required weekly psychological evaluations due to what the prison psychiatrist describes as persistent delusional episodes regarding her conviction. She still claims she was trying to help Margaret. She still insists that the morphine was for pain management, that the stolen money was just family financial planning, that everything she did was motivated by love and concern. Chuck is in a medium security facility about an hour away. Unlike Diane, he seems to have accepted responsibility for what he did. He's participated in victim impact programs, earned his GED, and even started teaching literacy classes to other inmates. His parole hearing is still 23 years away, but the correction officers I speak with say he's genuinely remorseful about his role in Margaret's death. Whether that remorse is genuine or just an act designed to improve his chances at eventual parole, I'll never know. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that both of them are exactly where they belong, locked away from society, unable to harm anyone else the way they harmed Margaret. Some people ask me if I feel satisfied with how everything turned out, if I feel like justice was served, if I feel like Margaret can rest in peace knowing her killers were caught and punished. The truth is more complicated than that. I feel satisfied that Diane and Chuck will spend the rest of their lives paying for what they did. I feel satisfied that Margaret's story has helped change laws and protect other vulnerable people. I feel satisfied that her foundation is doing work she would have been proud of. But satisfied isn't the same as happy. Justice isn't the same as healing. Margaret is still dead. I still wake up every morning in a bed that feels too big, in a house that feels too quiet, in a life that feels incomplete without her. The difference is that now, instead of waking up angry, I wake up purposeful. Instead of spending my days consumed by rage and the need for revenge, I spend them trying to honor Margaret's memory by helping other people. It's not the life I planned. It's not the retirement Margaret and I dreamed about during all those years of marriage, but it's a life with meaning, a life that makes a difference, a life that I think would make Margaret proud. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working in her garden or reviewing case files for the foundation, I can almost feel her presence. Not in any supernatural way. I'm not a man who believes in ghosts or spirits or messages from beyond, but in the way that people who truly love each other never really leave. In the way that the values they lived by, the kindness they showed, the love they gave, continues to ripple outward long after they're gone. Margaret was murdered by people who saw her illness as an opportunity, people who valued money more than family, greed more than love, people who were willing to slowly poison a dying woman rather than face their own financial failures with dignity. But Margaret's death also revealed something else: the power of truth to overcome deception, the strength that comes from fighting for justice even when the odds seem impossible, and the way that love, real, deep, lasting love, can transform even the darkest experiences into something meaningful. The Margaret Hartwell Foundation has helped over 300 families in the past 2 years. We've recovered more than $2 million in stolen assets. We've helped prosecute 47 cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. We've provided counseling, legal aid, and advocacy services to hundreds of people who thought they had nowhere else to turn. None of that brings Margaret back, but all of it honors her memory in a way that I think she would appreciate. Margaret spent her life teaching children, nurturing growth, helping young people develop into the best versions of themselves. The foundation continues that work, just with a different population and a different kind of education. We teach people how to recognize the warning signs of elder abuse. We teach them how to protect themselves and their loved ones from financial exploitation. We teach them that they don't have to suffer in silence, that there are people who will believe them and fight for them when their own families turn against them. It's not the legacy Margaret planned, but it's the legacy she earned through her courage in documenting her own murder. Her voice, captured on those final recordings, continues to speak for people who might otherwise never be heard. And that, I think, is a kind of justice that goes beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. It's the kind of justice that changes the world. One family at a time, one case at a time, one life at a time. 3 years after Margaret's death, I received a letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, mixed in with the usual foundation correspondence and donation acknowledgments. The return address showed it was from the Riverside Correctional Facility for Women, Diane's prison. But the handwriting wasn't hers. The letter was from another inmate, a woman named Patricia Wells, who'd been serving time for embezzlement and had become something of a jailhouse lawyer, helping other prisoners with legal research and appeals. What she had to tell me about Diane's time in prison made me realize that justice takes many forms, and sometimes the most profound punishment comes not from judges or juries, but from the natural consequences of one's own actions. Mr. Hartwell, the letter began, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I know about your wife's case, and I thought you should know what's been happening to Diane Morrison since she arrived here. What Patricia described was a woman whose carefully constructed facade had completely crumbled under the weight of prison life. Diane, who had spent decades manipulating and controlling people through charm and deception, had found herself in an environment where those skills not only didn't work, they made her a target. The other women here don't take kindly to child killers and elder abusers, Patricia wrote. Word got around quickly about what Diane did to her sick sister. In here, family loyalty means everything. Even the worst criminals have lines they won't cross, and slowly poisoning your dying sister crosses all of them. Diane had been attacked twice in her first year. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make it clear that she would never be safe in the general population. She'd been moved to protective custody, which meant 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than a closet, with 1 hour of supervised exercise in a cage-like recreation area. But the physical isolation was nothing compared to the psychological deterioration Patricia described. She talks to herself constantly, the letter continued. Whole conversations with someone she calls Margaret. Sometimes she's apologizing, begging for forgiveness. Other times she's angry, blaming Margaret for making her do what she did. The guards say she spends hours explaining to this invisible Margaret why the murder was really Margaret's fault for not signing the papers fast enough. This detail hit me like a physical blow. Even in prison, even after being convicted and sentenced, Diane was still trying to justify what she'd done. Still trying to make Margaret responsible for her own murder. But Patricia's letter revealed something else. Something that made me understand why she'd reached out to me in the first place. Mr. Hartwell, Diane has been filing appeals and motions constantly since she got here. She's convinced that if she can just find the right legal argument, she can get her conviction overturned. She's been working on something she calls the Gary deception, claiming that you somehow framed her for a crime she didn't commit. The Gary deception. Even after everything, Diane was still trying to make me the villain in her story. I think she's planning something, Patricia's letter concluded. She's been asking other inmates about hiring people on the outside, about getting messages delivered, about making problems for people who testified against her. I thought you should know, in case she tries to cause trouble for you or your foundation. I forwarded Patricia's letter to Agent Chen, who had stayed in touch since the arrest at the quarry. Within a week, the FBI had initiated an investigation into Diane's prison communications and discovered exactly what Patricia had suspected. Diane had been using other inmates and their visitors to try to hire someone to harass me, to damage the foundation, to discredit my work with elder abuse victims. She'd managed to scrape together about $3,000, money from her prison commissary account, and small amounts sent by a few remaining friends who still believed her claims of innocence. It wasn't enough to hire a professional, but it was enough to attract the attention of some very unsavory people who might have been willing to cause problems for the right price. Agent Chen arranged for enhanced monitoring of all Diane's communications, both written and verbal. What they discovered over the next 6 months painted a picture of a woman who had learned nothing from her conviction, felt no genuine remorse for her crimes, and was still actively trying to harm the people she blamed for her downfall. She's a classic narcissistic sociopath, the FBI's behavioral analyst explained to me during a briefing about the investigation. In her mind, she's not a criminal. She's a victim. Margaret was the selfish one for not cooperating with the financial arrangements. You were the vindictive one for exposing her crimes. The justice system was biased against her. Everyone else is wrong, and she's the innocent party being persecuted for trying to help her family. What happens now? Now she loses her phone privileges, her visitation rights, and any possibility of early release for good behavior. The conspiracy charges we're adding to her record will ensure she never gets out of prison alive. As I drove home from that FBI briefing, I realized something had shifted inside me. For 3 years, I'd been focusing on honoring Margaret's memory through the foundation work, trying to channel my grief and anger into something positive. But I'd always carried a small kernel of doubt about whether Diane truly understood the magnitude of what she'd done. Now I knew the answer. She didn't understand. She never would. In her mind, she was still the victim, still the misunderstood sister who'd been trying to help everyone and had been unfairly punished for her efforts. And strangely, that knowledge brought me a kind of peace, because it meant that my decision to dedicate my life to preventing elder abuse wasn't just about honoring Margaret's memory. It was about protecting other vulnerable people from individuals exactly like Diane, people who can justify any cruelty, rationalize any betrayal, as long as it serves their own interests. The foundation had grown significantly in the 3 years since Margaret's death. We now had offices in 5 states, a staff of 12 full-time advocates, and partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. But the case that brought us the most attention came 6 months after I received Patricia's letter. It started with a phone call from a woman in Phoenix named Carol Brennan. Her 83-year-old father had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and Carol's brother David had moved in with their father to provide care. Within months, Their father's savings account had been drained, his medication schedule had become erratic, and he'd started having what David called episodes that required increasingly heavy sedation. "It sounds exactly like what happened to your wife," Carol told me during our first phone conversation. "David keeps saying Dad is getting more agitated, more difficult to handle. But when I visit, Dad seems more confused and sleepy than agitated. And David won't let me take Dad to doctor appointments anymore. Says it's too stressful for him." We'd handled dozens of similar cases, but something about Carol's situation felt urgently familiar. Maybe it was the medication concerns, maybe it was the financial irregularities, or maybe it was just the way David was isolating his father from other family members. I flew to Phoenix and met with Carol in person. She'd done her homework, gathered bank statements, medication records, and detailed notes about her father's condition. The pattern was unmistakable. David had power of attorney over his father's finances and medical care. He'd been systematically withdrawing money from his father's accounts, claiming it was for medical expenses and home care services. But Carol had found receipts showing that David was buying expensive electronics, taking vacations, and making large cash withdrawals that couldn't be accounted for. More concerning were the medication records. David's father had been prescribed low-dose anxiety medication to help with the behavioral changes common in Alzheimer's patients. But Carol had found empty bottles suggesting her father was going through his medication much faster than prescribed. "I think David is overdosing him," Carol said. "I think he's using Dad's own medication to sedate him heavily so he can steal money without being questioned." We installed hidden cameras in the father's house while David was out. What we recorded over the next week was horrifying. David was indeed overdosing his father with the anxiety medication, crushing pills and mixing them into his father's food to keep him docile and confused. When his father had brief moments of clarity and asked about his missing money, or tried to call other family members, David would give him additional medication to make him sleep. But unlike Diane's careful escalation toward murder, David's plan was different. He wasn't trying to kill his father. He was trying to keep him alive but incapacitated for as long as possible, to continue draining his accounts and collecting his Social Security and pension payments. In some ways, it was even more cruel than what Diane had done to Margaret. We turned our evidence over to the Phoenix Police and Adult Protective Services. David was arrested and charged with elder abuse, financial exploitation, and assault. His father was removed from the home and placed in a legitimate memory care facility, where his condition actually improved once he was taken off the excessive medication. The case made national headlines because of its connection to the Margaret Hartwell Foundation and the similarities to Margaret's murder. Foundation Stops Another Family Killer ran on CNN. Elder Abuse Foundation Saves Phoenix Man from Son's Drug Scheme was the headline in USA Today. But for me, the most meaningful coverage came from a small article in the Phoenix local newspaper. Carol Brennan had written a letter to the editor that said simply, "The Margaret Hartwell Foundation gave my father his voice back. They gave our family justice when we thought there was nowhere else to turn. Margaret Hartwell's story saved my father's life." That letter is framed on my office wall right next to the last photo I took of Margaret in her garden, because that's what this work is really about. Not revenge, not punishment, not even justice in the legal sense. It's about giving voice to people who can't speak for themselves, protection to people who are vulnerable to those who should love them, and hope to families who think they're fighting these battles alone. Margaret didn't live to see her foundation grow into something that could help hundreds of families. She didn't live to see the laws that were passed in her name or the criminals who were caught because of the awareness her case brought to elder abuse issues. But in a way, she did live to see it. Because everything we've accomplished, every person we've helped, every family we've saved from going through what we went through, it all started with her courage in those final weeks of her life. Her decision to document her own murder, to gather evidence even as she was dying, to leave behind a record of what Diane and Chuck were doing to her. That decision has now protected hundreds of other vulnerable people from similar fates. Margaret spent 30 years teaching school, helping children learn and grow and develop into better versions of themselves. Through the foundation, she's still teaching. still helping people learn to recognize danger, to protect themselves and their families, to find strength they didn't know they had, still helping them grow into survivors instead of victims. And that, I've realized, is the deepest kind of justice. Not the kind that comes from courtrooms and prison sentences, but the kind that comes from taking the worst thing that's ever happened to you and transforming it into something that prevents the worst thing from happening to someone else. Margaret's murderers are in prison, and they'll die there. But Margaret's legacy is out in the world, still growing, still protecting people, still making a difference in ways she never could have imagined when she was whispering into that little digital recorder in her final weeks of life. If you've been following this story, wondering whether good can really triumph over evil, whether justice can really be served, whether one person's voice can really make a difference in the world, well, I have 3 years of evidence that says yes. Sometimes it takes longer than we want. Sometimes it takes forms we don't expect. Sometimes it requires us to become people we never thought we'd have to be. But justice, real justice, always finds a way. 5 years have passed since I stood at Margaret's grave on that cold October morning and heard Diane's words that changed my life forever. 5 years since I began the journey from grief to rage to revenge to something resembling redemption. I'm 70 now, and I wake up every morning in the house that Margaret and I shared for 37 years. The same house that Diane tried to steal from me. The same house where I discovered the truth about Margaret's murder. But it doesn't feel like the same house anymore. The rooms that once echoed with grief and anger now hum with purpose. The foundation offices occupy what used to be Margaret's sewing room in my home office. The kitchen table where I once sat in despair, reading forged divorce papers, now host weekly meetings with families who need help navigating their own battles against elder abuse. Margaret's garden still blooms every October, those defiant red roses that refuse to surrender to the approaching winter. I tend them carefully, and every year they seem to grow stronger, more vibrant, as if drawing strength from the soil where her ashes are scattered beneath their roots. This morning, like every morning for the past 5 years, I start my day by reading the cards and letters that arrive from families we've helped. Today there's a thank you note from a woman in Oregon whose foundation advocate helped her expose her stepfather's financial exploitation of her mother. There's a photo from a man in Texas whose elderly uncle was rescued from a medication abuse situation that bore disturbing similarities to what happened to Margaret. And there's a letter from someone I never expected to hear from again. The envelope is marked with the return address of Riverside Correctional Facility, but it's not from Patricia Wells or any of the other inmates who occasionally write to update me on Diane's condition. The handwriting is shaky, uncertain, like someone who hasn't held a pen in a long time. It's from Chuck. Mr. Hartwell, the letter begins. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I wanted you to know that I think about Margaret every day. I think about what we did to her, and I think about how I should have stopped it. I set the letter down and pour myself a cup of coffee. Margaret's favorite blend that I still buy out of habit. Through the kitchen window I can see the memorial garden the foundation planted last year. 7 maple trees representing the 7 families we helped in our first year. Now grown tall enough to provide shade for the bench where I sometimes sit when the weight of other people's stories becomes too heavy to carry. I pick up Chuck's letter and continue reading. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't mean anything after what we did. I know it doesn't bring Margaret back or undo the pain we caused you. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what we really took from the world when we killed your wife. The letter goes on to describe Chuck's life in prison, his work teaching literacy to other inmates, his participation in victim impact programs. But what stops me is his description of a conversation he had with a fellow prisoner whose grandmother had died of cancer. He was telling me about how his grandmother fought the cancer for 3 years, how brave she was, how she never complained about the pain or the treatments. He said she used her last months to teach him and his cousins about family history, to pass down stories about their ancestors, to make sure they knew how much she loved them. Chuck's handwriting becomes even more unsteady at this point, with several crossed-out words and what might be tear stains on the paper. That's when I realized what we really stole, Mr. Hartwell. We didn't just steal Margaret's money or her life. We stole her death. We stole those precious final months when she should have been saying goodbye to the people she loved, sharing her wisdom, leaving behind memories instead of mysteries. I have to stop reading again. Because Chuck is right. In all my focus on justice and punishment and building Margaret's legacy through the foundation, I'd never quite articulated what felt so fundamentally wrong about how Margaret died. She should have had time to say goodbye, time to tell me all the things she wanted me to know, time to plan for my future without her, to help me prepare for the loneliness that was coming, time to review our life together, to laugh about the good memories and make peace with the difficult ones. Instead, her final weeks were spent in a fog of artificial drowsiness, confused and suspicious but unable to identify the source of her confusion, fighting to stay conscious long enough to gather evidence against the people who were supposed to be caring for her. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Chuck's letter continues, but I wanted you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it anyway. I've been working with the prison chaplain to develop a program for inmates who've committed crimes against elderly victims. We call it the Margaret Project, if that's all right with you. The Margaret Project. 25 years into his sentence, Chuck is still thinking about my wife, still trying to find ways to honor her memory from inside a prison cell. I pause, thinking about what Margaret would want me to say, what would honor her memory while acknowledging the genuine remorse Chuck seems to be expressing. You're right that what you and Diane stole from Margaret, and from me, was more than money or property. You stole time, you stole dignity, you stole the peaceful death that someone who fought cancer as bravely as Margaret deserved to have. But you're wrong about one thing. Margaret's death was never meaningless. From the moment she started documenting what you were doing to her, her death began saving other lives. Her voice, captured on those recordings, still speaks for victims who might otherwise never be heard. I tell Chuck about the foundation, about the families we've helped, about the laws that have been changed because of Margaret's case. I tell him about Carol Brennan's father in Phoenix, about the dozens of other elderly people who are alive and safe today because Margaret found the strength to create evidence of her own murder. If the Margaret Project you've described is genuine, I write, if it's truly designed to prevent other families from experiencing what we experienced, then I support it. Margaret believed in education, in helping people learn from their mistakes, in the possibility that even the worst situations could be transformed into something meaningful. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Morrison. My support for your prison program is not forgiveness. What you and Diane did to Margaret is unforgivable. It always will be. But my wife believed that good people could do terrible things and still find a way back to being good people. She believed in redemption, even when she didn't believe in forgiveness. I pause in my writing, looking again at Margaret's portrait. In the 5 years since her death, I've learned that there's a difference between forgiveness and letting go. I will never forgive Chuck and Diane for what they did to Margaret, but I can let go of the anger that once consumed me, the need for revenge that once drove every decision I made. The Margaret Hartwell Foundation will provide educational materials for your prison program, I continue writing. We'll share resources, statistics, and case studies that might help other inmates understand the full impact of elder abuse. Not because I forgive you, but because Margaret would want her story to prevent as much future suffering as possible. You have 20 more years left on your sentence, Mr. Morrison. Margaret doesn't get 20 more years. I don't get 20 more years with her. But if you spend those 20 years genuinely trying to prevent other families from losing what we lost, then maybe that's enough. I sign the letter and set it aside to mail later. Then I walk outside to Margaret's garden, to the roses that are just beginning to show their October buds. 5 years ago, I stood in this same garden and discovered Diane and Chuck breaking into my house, searching for evidence that Margaret had hidden to protect herself. 5 years ago, I was a broken man consumed with grief and rage, unable to see past my own pain to imagine any kind of future worth living. Today I'm still a man who misses his wife every moment of every day. But I'm also a man who has found purpose in tragedy, meaning in loss. and hope in the possibility that Margaret's death might prevent other deaths like hers. The foundation work will continue long after I'm gone. The laws passed in Margaret's name will protect vulnerable people for decades to come. The families we've helped will go on to help other families, creating ripples of protection and awareness that will spread far beyond anything Margaret and I could have imagined. And maybe in some small way, Chuck's Margaret Project will add to that legacy. Maybe prisoners who might otherwise never understand the full impact of their crimes will learn from Margaret's story. Maybe some of them will find ways to make amends, to dedicate their remaining years to preventing the kinds of crimes they once committed. It won't bring Margaret back. It won't undo the pain of losing her, or the horror of learning how she really died. But it will mean that her death continues to save lives, continues to protect families, continues to transform tragedy into something resembling hope. I pick one of the October roses, still damp with morning dew, and carry it inside to place next to Margaret's portrait. "Thank you, sweetheart," I whisper to her picture. "Thank you for being brave enough to document what they were doing to you. Thank you for giving me everything I needed to make sure they could never hurt anyone else. Thank you for loving me enough to leave behind the tools for justice." The phone rings. Probably another family in crisis, another elderly person in danger, another situation where Margaret's foundation can make a difference. I answer it, ready to help, ready to fight, ready to transform someone else's tragedy into survival and strength. Because that's what Margaret taught me in those final recordings, in her careful documentation of her own murder, in her decision to gather evidence even as she was dying. That love doesn't end with death. That protecting people doesn't end with your own suffering. That the most powerful form of justice is not revenge, but prevention. 5 years after Margaret's death, I finally understand what she was trying to tell me in her final letter. Take care of yourself. Try to find happiness again. I thought happiness meant moving on, forgetting, letting the past stay buried. But I was wrong. Happiness, I've learned, means taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and transforming it into something that prevents the worst thing from happening to someone else. Margaret's voice still speaks for people who have no voice. Her courage still protects people who need protection. Her love still reaches out to touch families she never met, in situations she never could have imagined. And I get to be the instrument of that ongoing grace, the executor of that continuing legacy, the guardian of a love story that death couldn't end. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to every detail of how Margaret was murdered and how justice was finally served, then you understand something important about the nature of evil and the power of good to overcome it. Evil is real. There are people in this world who will exploit vulnerability, betray trust, and harm the innocent for nothing more than personal gain. People like Diane and Chuck exist in every community, in every family, in every circle of trust where vulnerable people need protection. But good is more powerful than evil. Love is stronger than greed. Truth is more durable than deception. And sometimes, when evil does its worst, it creates the very conditions that allow good to do its best. Margaret's murder was evil, but Margaret's legacy is good. Her foundation protects people. Her laws save lives. Her story gives hope to families who thought they were fighting alone. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like Margaret's are happening right now, in your community, maybe in your own family. The signs of elder abuse are often subtle. The perpetrators often trusted family members, the victims often too ashamed or frightened to ask for help. But if you know what to look for, if you understand how these crimes work, if you're willing to be the voice for someone who has lost their voice, then you can be part of the solution. You can be part of Margaret's ongoing legacy of protection and justice. Because that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not punishment, not even justice in the traditional sense. It's about love. About the love that refuses to die even when the beloved is gone. About the love that transforms grief into purpose, tragedy into protection, and death into ongoing life. Margaret is gone. But her love remains, working through the foundation, through changed laws, through protected families, through prevented crimes. Working through people like you who understand that the most powerful way to honor the dead is to protect the living. That's Margaret's final gift to the world. That's the justice she earned through her courage in those final weeks of life. And that's the happiness I've finally found. Not in moving on from Margaret's death, but in carrying forward Margaret's life in every family we help, every law we change, every tragedy we prevent. Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved wife, guardian angel, protector of the vulnerable. Her voice speaks on,